All right, we're going to get the legend, strength and conditioning coach Matt Cooper on this live. He works with a lot of pro and amateur. He's going to be joining us in a minute. We're going to be talking a lot about nutrition in pro sports and extreme dieting in pro sports, the impact that can have on an athlete. There he is. You there, Cooper?
Yeah, I'm here. I can't really see you. Can you see me all right?
No, you don't see me. You might have to flip your camera around.
Okay.
Oh, we got some extra virgin olive oil.
Got some,
We got your
yeah, so living a lifestyle here. Got some coffee. There we go.
All right, here we go. Matt Cooper, I've known for a few years. He's kind of runs a facility in Southern California, works with a lot of pro and amateur athletes, strength and conditioning, and a complete wealth of knowledge when it comes to nutrition as well. So we're going to talk a lot about nutrition in sports, how pro athletes are using nutrition, how they're getting nutrition wrong and lifestyle wrong, and talk to Matt about some of his experiences in that world.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. It's been great just getting to know you these last few years too, and I'm excited to dive into this stuff.
Awesome. So we really want to talk about like the main things. Obviously, we're kind of living in a completely different environment than human beings have ever lived in, and this is having an impact on our health. So athletes are no different. I guess, like, what are some of the trends you're seeing in terms of athletes, injuries, being able to kind of maintain their health throughout these like rigorous seasons, and like if there's one or two things that you think athletes are kind of missing the boat on when it comes to some of these inputs that we're putting into our bodies?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say, just to kind of back up for a second, as far as like a lot of the problems athletes are having right now with performance issues and with injuries, I've always been of the mind that you hear people talk in the NFL, because they play on turf half the time, they play on grass some of the time. I've always been of the mind that that's not the case, because even if it is let's say a factor or a small factor, the NFL is not the only place that has injuries, right? You're seeing it in the NBA, you're seeing it in the NFL, you're seeing it in the MLB, and so on and so forth, right? You're even seeing it in combat sports in some cases. And so it kind of naturally led me to think, all right, there's got to be something else, right? And like in kind of exploring that, I was like, all right, what are some of the commonalities here? And then eventually it led me to kind of plot the modern sports injury epidemic. You can kind of see how it's become like a thing. It's become like a big problem, really paralleling a lot of society's declining health, right? You see a lot of these Neolithic diseases, type 2 diabetes, like, a lot of different health issues we just didn't have before. You see a lot of these things just sort of, almost like you could literally parallel them in some cases. And I think it's multifactorial, to be fair. There's training inputs. The game is played at more, extreme angles and things like that now, for sure. Paul Favorites has mentioned that. But I do think, if you look across our modern environment, it's a lot more maladaptive and degenerative from an input standpoint, right? Whether we're talking diet, sleep, et cetera, et cetera. But so just giving people background context now, as far as diets go, I think like the worst thing I see pro athletes do is think one of two things. They think that because, they got to where they got to eating junk, that they can kind of do that forever, right? Some of these guys, it's like their superpower is being able to overcome bad physiological inputs. On the other side of that, I see a lot of athletes turning to some extreme diet because, maybe they get injured, or maybe they hear what someone else is doing and then they try to go plant-based, they try to go keto, they try to go carnivore, they try to do this more extreme diet that they claim is kind of about health, but it's actually A, not best for performance, and B, might even be degenerative.
So basically, like, because when you look at it from the outside perspective, we have more technology, they have better travel amenities, They're like back in the 90s, if you're looking at just the NBA, you know, because that's the league I've worked in for 15 years and have a knowledge on the history of, you're talking about a more physical game. You know, like they were letting guys get away with everything on the court. I mean, you can just watch the games. Talking about they're flying commercial. They didn't have the same nutritional science that we have. They didn't have the recovery or the sports science or all these potential factors that are going to lead to less injuries. But in reality, you know, and I don't have the numbers on this. Maybe you do have the numbers on this, but when you look at some of the, if you just went to like the player profile of some of like the players from the earlier generation, you're seeing these guys were playing 80, 82 games like every year. Like there's like maybe one outlier year where like Karl Malone like missed a few games, but these guys were playing like an absurd amount of games comparatively speaking to today. So it's like something like you said has to be amiss, because like it's kind of like you're seeing the opposite now where all these guys are playing like 55, 60 games now, at least in the NBA. I mean, do you see this as, I think like you said, it's multifactorial. What about the idea that like this load management idea that we've seen kind of explode? Is this I guess my first inclination is I think it's creating like a psychological factor in the athlete's mind where if you constantly telling them you're tired, like, oh, the numbers say you're tired, they start to believe that they're tired. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get you. Like a self-fulfilling prophecy, some level of subconscious influence there.
Okay, so I guess like if you're working with a pro athlete and he's had, you know, a few seasons of too many injuries and whatnot, he's coming to you, like what are the first couple things that you're doing to kind of work with him to kind of make sure he's optimized as much as possible?
Yeah, great question. I would say just to backtrack for a second, if people just want me to kind of, just to be fair and talk about different multifactorial inputs, I don't think it's like exclusively diet or anything like that. That's not what I'm trying to say. I do think, there's differences you could say in training. Things maybe guys do, like training sciences evolved in a lot of ways, but maybe it hasn't in other ways. Footwear, is another factor potentially as well. The way the game is played, maybe like you said, it may be more physical at that time, but also like physical in a different way, not necessarily like getting lower and cutting out of some of these extreme joint angles, things like that. Pace, more possessions, things like that also is another thing now. But I look back at that time and I also see things like, recess has become screen time for a lot of the kids now. It's even being cut in some of these childhood programs. Whereas in the past, you and I were playing sports and a lot of these guys were multi-sport athletes, Jordan, baseball, Kobe, soccer, for example. And they grew up playing and developing a lot of different motor programs that way, which I think, really helps carry over to durability. I also think that was probably the last generation that really spent most of its time out in the sun, right? And kind of had a more natural sleep cycle in general. There was probably much less actually of a screen time influence on our sleep cycles. We got a lot more natural light and kind of biorhythms. There was a lot more writing on paper at school versus, perpetually typing. Screen time also can disturb the visual field as far as different aspects of our vision, right? It can get us stuck in kind of certain types of more of a focal type vision and help us lose access to peripheral vision, which can be a problem. So I think I can go on, but I think that, you can kind of get the idea that there's just a more natural environment back then. And so, a big reason right now why I think you're seeing these problems is this evolutionary mismatch, right? This environmental mismatch. There's how humans are meant to thrive versus what we have now. And there's not a lot of congruency there. And I think that's part of what's seeding the current health epidemics that you're seeing and, the human life expectancy shortening and stuff like that. And I also think there's elements of that overlap to help seed the current sports injury epidemic. So just to give everybody context on where that theory came from, it's not completely rooted in a made up by you and I, you know what I mean? And then as far as nutritionally, lifestyle wise, it's similar to developing skill work, right? You just kind of want to help people with the fundamentals to answer your question. You want to make sure they're doing the minimum effective dose when it comes to sleep. You want to make sure they're doing the minimum effective dose at the very least, right? when it comes to their diet, both in terms of eating enough and then also in terms of eating a diet that's like got a higher energy yield or micronutrient content to it relative to the energy expenditure from the work it takes to digest it or from inflammation and things like that. So try to create some favorable energetic ROI there. Other things too, making sure they're getting as much natural light as possible. And obviously there's weeds you can go into with each one of those things, but I would say if I had to put a simple answer to it, that would be it.
So basically, we think that we can draw lines between athletes that are on their phones probably a ton. I mean, you're getting a lot of stress from social media. I mean, these guys probably have millions of followers, some of them, which I think no human brain is meant to even deal with. And they're probably on their phones a ton, staying indoors. They're not getting outside. They're traveling a ton, and that could be deteriorating their body. Just these very basic things that people potentially take for granted.
Yeah. Again, I think some of them are a lot more minor than others, right? Like I think, being on your phone, the bigger deal is probably like late, like just a collection of blue light being on your phone later on. I do think there's like something to be said about it interfering your vision and performance elements of that or ocular motor elements of that as far as how you recruit certain muscles at the right time and reflexes and so on and so forth. But yeah, by and large, I think these things that we tend to take for granted because they're not a revelation, right? They're not sexy. It's like, oh, you really need to dial in your sleep. You need to eat foods that are like more in line with what humans are meant to thrive on, right? It's like everybody wants to look more for like, oh, this technology or this specific training method. And I am a reasonably particular guy when it comes to training, but even then, as someone who does it for a living, I got to concede that like I think some of these other things are just a lot more important, and I think at the end of the day, like no one is surprised when you take a fish outside the fish tank and it dies, right? Like it's kind of the same thing for humans. It's like it's not as obvious or fast, the way it occurs, but it's like, it's like if you feed your dog, half the wrong food for a while, it probably will get sick and live a shorter life and not thrive as much, at the very least over time. I think that's a pretty fair example for what's going on now. You don't walk your dog, you don't take it out in the sun, you don't do everything you're meant to do. It's like it's probably not going to be that healthy of it or like physically fit of an organism. And I think with human beings, you can kind of say the same thing.
So what is like, I don't want to paint too broad of a stroke, but what is like the typical athlete, like what is their diet before that they come to you?
Oh man, it's usually junk. Depends on the age, right? I work with everybody from like mostly, developing athletes, some pro obviously, and I help people kind of remotely as well, at least on the nutrition side of things. Uh, a lot of times it's junk, man. You're looking at stuff like DK Metcalf or Anthony Edwards, where they're like, the guys are eating diets like that, where there's like a high degree of inflammatory foods in there, and maybe they've just had such a good metabolism and they're so robust of an organism, they can kind of get away with it. And so it's also hard to talk them out of it because it's like, well, I got to be D1 or I got to be pro doing this stuff, and it's like, yeah, that is your superpower. You can overcome some of this bad physiology, but how long is that going to be the case that you can overcome those bad physiological inputs, right? I think it's more about longevity at that point. I'm not going to make them better if they're if they're already that good, but it's like 99.9% of us are not those freak athletes like Michael Jordan who can just not sleep and still perform at that level, right? So what I would just tell people is like, when I'm working with them is like, all right, if you're not that dude, you got to be doing everything right to try to get to that level. If you're D2 and trying to go D1, if you're D1 trying to make the league, if you're in the league and you're getting some minutes and you want, to do a little bit better, you want more minutes, whatever it is, like if you're not in that 0.0000 whatever percent it is, like you got to be doing all the little things and you got to be doing them right. So that's usually the diet that they come to me with, is like kind of eating junk, or they're doing this sort of pseudo health diet, right? They're like, oh, I'm going to like cut out all fat, or I'm going to go low carb, or I'm going to do plant-based or something like that. So sometimes they will come to me like at the very least health-minded, which I think is positive, but then they're doing this kind of extreme diet because that's unfortunately what permeates the mainstream, right? Those are the more extreme black and white voices are the ones that get, unfortunately, like the most platforms in this, in this day and age this short attention span age. Not context doesn't really sell.
So I think, at least in the holistic health world, people a lot of times gravitate to this idea that, oh, genetics don't matter, which, like, I'm not saying they cause everything, but, you know, I could have never been Usain Bolt. I could have never been Michael Jordan, no matter how hard I worked, right? So, like, if these guys have, like, the physical structure and, like, the athletic prowess, like, isn't it fair to assume also that, like, potentially some people have stronger internal organs, stronger constitution to kind of digest anything that they're putting into their body? They're just like, if you're stronger on the outside, why is it not feasible that some of these people can obviously be strong on the inside, where they're overcoming some of these bad nutrition choices? That makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's what I always tell people is like these are not good. There may be good role models in the sense of like, you know, cultivating a work ethic from someone like Kobe Bryant, right? But they're not good role models in the sense of their diet sometimes, and that could be because they're at least at that phase of their life where they're so good. Like I said, they can overcome bad physiological inputs, whether it's like, you know, Michael Jordan sleep cycles, whether it's a guy like DK Metcalf in the NFL eating junk, Derrick Rose for a period of time eating junk. But even then, those guys tend to crack, right? At some point, whether it's after later in their career, close to retirement, once they crack, they tend to really degenerate and not be able to perform at the same level or stay healthy at the same level, be as durable. And then there's also, you know, even within that same pro athlete sphere, there's also a lot of cautionary tales. There's a lot of examples. You know, you can name names if you want, but there's a lot of cautionary examples of guys doing these extreme diets, and then they kind of like almost without fail, again, aside from like a very, very, very small set of outliers, all the ones who are not the Michael Jordans and things like that, a lot of them seem to deal with these kind of, at the very least, ticky-tack injuries that are more degenerative based, and some of them seem to be like kind of chronically hurt in injuries that are unrelated, right? It's not like I keep hurting my the same ankle or knee or something like that. Sometimes it seems to be all different like types of injuries, which I think kind of, you know, if you're doing an orbital bone and then a, you know, hand and then a knee, it's like at that point is like I would assume the person is probably in a little bit more of a degenerative state, right? It's one thing to kind of have the same injury getting re-aggravated, but yeah, kind of a meandering way to answer that question, but hopefully you get the idea.
So kind of, because you mentioned guys like Derrick Rose, and we don't even know because these are theories, right? It's not like we can go back and
Exactly.
trace back and be like, oh, because, I mean, but it's kind of the elephant in the room where some of these guys, like him specifically, you're just looking at his case, right? Like he was on his way to the Hall of Fame career. He still might get there, but he had injury after injury after injury, and nobody ever talked about the fact that, like, and he was very public with these ideas that, like, he was eating extremely high sugar diets, like candy. Like, I think he had a nickname, Pooh, or something, because he was just always eating like honey and stuff like that as a kid. And nobody, like, nobody in the media or nobody even in the sports realm, because I was working in the NBA at this point, I've never heard anybody hypothesize that these injuries were potentially coming from the fact, or at least contributed to by the fact that he was eating, like, you know, terrible diet, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And, you know, sometimes the information is really put out there with these guys and they tell you exactly what they're doing. If you're not directly working with them, other times not, right? But he was one that, you know, he talked about growing up poor. A lot of times he talks about his diet was, you know, he's always been a candy head, and he continued those habits even after he had the money to eat, you know, healthier. But, you know, in your childhood, that like 0 to 18, or let's say in the womb to 18, that's your main adaptation window, I think, in terms of what you're doing to your body from both a physicality input perspective, maybe 0 to 21, but also just from your diet too. And so I think, like, in some ways, I think you could potentially see at least theorize that the situation was seeded by him. Kind of, he's talking literally about like eating, you know, all types of like candies, junk, stuff like that, because they couldn't afford anything else, right? So yeah, things like that, just in terms of like physiology, whether or not that was the case here, I can't say for sure, but you know, you're going to cause like nerve inflammation. You're going to cause like poor tissue quality. The tissue is going to degenerate, things like that. He's not going to have enough adaptive steroid hormones to help recover his tissues, you know, potential thyroid issues. There's a lot of different micronutrient deficiencies leading to bone mineral deficiencies. There's so many individual small rabbit holes you could take that conversation. But yeah, in general, you can look at stuff like that. You can look at, a guy like Eric Bledsoe, who used to be one of the most explosive guys in the league, goes plant-based, and then all of a sudden he's not only gets hurt, but he loses his pop. And that one does sort of track with the timeline. Michael Porter Jr., 4 back surgeries before age 25, also plant-based. I think there's like keto examples too that you and I have talked about. So there's just a lot of these examples where like a poor diet tends to coincide with like either always having these ticky-tack injuries, sometimes even having a noted reduction in performance as far as strength and explosiveness.
So we're seeing poor diet potentially, and this is anecdotal, but like it's almost like we're just like some of these movies and this like Netflix propaganda that they're putting out where it's like eating a plant-based diet and they're like cherry picking like 5. I didn't even watch the movies. I just know who funds them, and I know that there's a lot of like trickery going on there where they're trying to convince people that going on like one of these extreme diets, in this case a plant-based diet, is like leading to more prodigious athleticism, whatever you want to call it. And like we have just as many examples on the other side where it's like potentially deteriorating their careers on both accords, like overly meat-based and overly plant-based. Would you say that's accurate?
Big time, yeah. I think both, every extreme diet cult likes to point at one example, like, look at this jacked CrossFitter who's, by the way, obviously on steroids, but he's plant-based. You can build muscle doing that. Or like, hey, here's this like keto person who's thriving. And it's like, like the examples we just gave, Michael Jordan thriving on no sleep, and DK Metcalf in the NFL eating just total junk, candy, so on. Anthony Edwards, like I think it was Cheetos every day, a bunch of other junk. It's like you can also get examples of people thriving doing absolutely like nothing for their health. So I don't think it's helpful to look, it can be done, because you can look at biology, look at nature. All it takes is one alligator having, let's say, being born with an extra leg or something, to be able to say, oh, alligators can have 5 legs. But that's different than saying like what happens on average. On average, for most people, when I see them go keto, they tend to lose a lot of their explosiveness, lose a lot of their strength. They tend to lose their hair, their skin tends to degenerate. Like you can physically see them degenerating too. And the same thing with plant-based. You see all those same degenerative things, and then you see people just sort of like lose any and all muscle mass. For the most part, you tend to see them kind of like wither away, and then usually like have a lot of these ticky-tack injuries. So I would just put that out there, that like just because there's an example of someone who can do it doesn't mean that that's the expected result.
Yeah, I don't know why athlete, like intuitively speaking, would ever go keto. Like because if carbohydrates are the easiest source of fuel for the human body to use, and these people are just running through so much physical activity, like why would you want to put that much stress on your body to convert all these things into the right energy source, if that makes sense? I know you've got all the terms, gluconeogenesis and all these terms for the people.
Yeah, I was trying to keep it basic, but yeah, I mean, that's how it is, right? Is like keto, it takes a lot longer to produce ATP. People who are less scientifically inclined, that's like the big point of the body, right? That's the energy we have to spend on everything we do, from thinking to muscle firing, right? You're running your immune system, all the different interplay that occurs in our physiological systems, right? So basically with keto, it produces ATP, certainly, but it's kind of like a longer way to get there. Whereas most sports, it's like they're like football, basketball, MMA, whatever. It's like explosive bouts of activity on repeat. So I need an instantaneously available energy source for that to happen, which is glucose, right? And if I'm on the other side of the Krebs cycle, I'm saying extremely there, let's say keto, what's going to end up happening is like to get that energy, my body has to mine for it. It has to mine and break down my own tissue. Like you just said, gluconeogenesis, right? In order to manufacture my fat into fuel. It's not bad to do, you know, have elements of that going on in your physiology. You're never running on just one thing, right? But it's like if that's your main energy source, it's like your metabolism literally compensates, A, and B, it's actually challenging to mind that, right? You're going to release all kinds of stress hormones in the body, which is going to cause tissue degeneration. Um, it's going to make you like your nervous system just works slower. You're going to be at 3G instead of 5G. And then, you know, you protract that over a long enough period of time, right? It's like no big deal if you travel and it happens here and there, but you fast in an extreme capacity, you do keto over a long period of time, and what ends up happening is your metabolism literally compensates the same way you might compensate if you hurt an ankle and you walk weird, right? So in that sense, what goes on is something known as, like, on the calorie side, adaptive thermogenesis, but there's like a bigger picture thing that goes on where your physiology kind of turns itself into a Prius. It's like I want to hibernate in this metabolic winter and conserve energy, so I'm only going to use, you know, I basically can only allocate energy to things that are fundamentally essential, like immune system. And even with these fundamental systems like that, it's like it doesn't even have enough energy to like power the whole thing, right? So that's why, like, you see people do some of these extreme diets, and then some of the more optional parts of our physiology, like being able to burn fat efficiently or build muscle efficiently or maintain our hair color and things like that, they tend to regress because our system prioritizes the things that are like most essential, right? It's kind of like if I needed to remodel my house and the foundation is like really fucked up, I'm probably going to address that first before I remodel like something optional like the chimney, right? That's just fine. I just want to do some, like, I don't know, some different adjustment to it or modification, right? So your body kind of works the same way. That's why I say you can kind of see some of the degeneration, not always, but eventually you can kind of see it visually occur in people. Like, I'll study players like hairlines and see what they're doing. I'll study players like wrinkles that they're getting, if they're having ticky-tack injuries that are seemingly unrelated to each other. But yeah, anyways, with any of these extreme diets, whether it's too low of calories, whether it's keto, whatever, your metabolism is going to compensate, when really what we want is your metabolism to run more like a you know, V8, like a hot rod, like a gas guzzler, where there's a higher RPMs and turnover rate, kind of like it is when we're kids, when we not only have a robust amount of energy in the system, but also we're pulling energy through the system fast, right? And so when you're in more of a state like that, it actually creates a sense of more of like a adaptiveness and robustness to the inputs of stress. That's why, and you've heard Dr. Ray Peat talk about this, you'll see like pretty crazy types of degenerative issues occur in kids, like maybe like cutting off the tip of a fingers, like always the famous example people give, and then being able to regrow that, right? They're so regenerative, they're so energy dense, right? And then as we age, we tend to do that over time.
Okay,
So sorry to be long-winded, but
we
hopefully
hate
that
the
makes sense.
keto. We hate the keto diet. We hate the vegan diet for
Yep.
athletes. I'd say from my experience in sports, I think people like don't quite understand. They think like just because it's like the highest level of performance in the world, like just take the NBA for example, they think like they have the best nutrition, they have the best approaches to, you know, strength and conditioning and whatnot. But like to me, they take a very Western medicine approach to all these things. It's like if you have the Derrick Rose example, like they're just kind of investigating. They're only looking at like, oh, the knee and look at the movement and all these things. They're not even considering that these other factors in his lifestyle can be playing a massive part. And then if you just walked into NBA facilities and looked at what they're actually feeding players, it's not like all it's like in hospitals too, right? Where it's like they'll cut corners and like feed these people the worst possible food. Not that they're doing that in the NBA. They have like high quality in a lot of cases, but you'll also see, and then when it comes to the staff, they're eating Ruffles potato chips and Nature Valley granola bars and like all this ridiculous stuff. And it's like, if you are going to want to compete at the highest level, you know, even as an executive, you have to be like on top of it. You want the best fuel. So it's like they're dumbing themselves down in the name of like what really is an addiction to processed crap, because I think all of us that have been exposed to us kind of have to break free from that. But it's not as like high level as people actually think. They're dealing with the same problems that normal humans deal with, and they're not just like eating the cleanest stuff possible. Like they're pretty reckless with it, if you ask me.
Yeah, big time. I think in the beginning, it's just, I don't necessarily blame them. It is kind of, there's more thought that goes into it, right? We're sold a lot of like products, like you mentioned Nature Valley bars. We're sold a lot of, even the people who try to be health minded, we're sold a lot of stuff that's health, and that's why I love your page so much. We're sold a lot of foods that are health, that are like pseudo health foods too. And you like look at, like you turn the back of the package over, and it's really kind of a bunch of nonsense in there in terms of ingredients, maybe intermixed with some good stuff sometimes, but put a little thought into it up front, and it gets a little bit better. But yeah, I agree with you like wholeheartedly. I work in the private sector. I've been offered, and been around that world. I've had, MBA and, D1 college offers and that kind of stuff. I just like the private sector better, but I do remember like you would think they'd have the best food, but then meanwhile, it's like they're cooking it in like industrial seed oils and stuff like that, just clearly degenerative stuff. So it's like if the catering can't even get some of that stuff, like really fundamental stuff, right? It's like, again, as someone who for a living, on top of the nutrition, literally like, nerds out on training and training nuances. It's like, if I can't even get some of the fundamentals right, I don't know that everything that I'm even saying specificity wise on the training side really even matters as much. If we can't, if we can't dial in the fundamentals, just like a sport, like you're going to learn like a layup and a free throw before you learn like a step back three, right? Same kind of thing. So yeah, totally agree to your point there. And then also like, I think we should also just put it like for people following, especially any student athletes, developing athletes, younger athletes, you can't always trust what the media says people are doing too. Because I've seen like reports recently. A good friend of mine showed me like an article on this so-and-so. He's a guard in the league right now. He's plant-based, but then you read the article and it's really just like, oh, I gave up pork. It's like he still eats meat. He still eats a good amount of meat. He just doesn't really eat pork, right? But the misleading title, and he eats a lot of fruit and stuff that is plant derived, but then the article says, oh, he's plant based. And it's like, well, wait a minute, he's not actually vegan. He really just doesn't eat one type of meat. He still eats plenty of meat. He just eats a shit ton of fruits and stuff. It's like, does that, so I would just say like, don't always believe the headlines, because a lot of times what they say athletes are doing, they're also not even doing.
Yeah. So let's talk about like some of the things that you do, or like, let's talk about your diet, because, I think you've got like a great perspective on it. And I do want to add one thing that you talked about, like these things that were being sold, like in terms, like, let's just like make it pretty simple for people. If it comes in a package and it's like processed at all, like I'm not saying some of, like you have a difference between ultra processed and just processed food. You're talking about like huge discrepancies in some of the ingredients that they're using. But even the best quality cereal or chips, like, if you're going to go buy a bag of chips and you want to get like Siete or like that Boulder brand when they're using much better ingredients, it's not healthy. It's not like contributing to, a robust human being. It's just better. And it's like a decent snack option for people that are like trying to upgrade in these little ways. But it's not like, yeah, like this should be a major part of a healthy diet. And that goes for any of these products: energy bars, granola, cereal, chips. Any of these things, like in my opinion, they're not like last night I was at the games at the Staples Center crypto arena, and like I'm like not gonna eat arena food. So I brought like one of those solely fruit jerkies and like a bag of like Epic beef liver and like beef jerky. That's like those are like the best options of like processed food. And I'm not like, oh yeah, that was a really hearty, fulfilling, great meal. It was just like way better than eating the crap that they're gonna try to sell me at the arena.
Yeah, exactly. I have to give the Sacramento Kings some credit at I think it's still the Golden One Arena. I remember, being on site there fairly early on and like being impressed. They actually had like grass-fed beef there, like some grass-fed ground beef burgers. I don't know what they were cooked in necessarily, but I was at least happy to see that. But yeah, no, totally feel you on that. I think, yeah, for the most part, right? There's things that are intentionally processed. Like you eat like a bag, you get a bag of salt, right? Or you get tea, or you get coffee. Like there's things like that that are exceptions, right? But yeah, I mean, by and large, I'm sure over 90% of the things that you're seeing that are highly processed like that at the typical store are what you want to avoid by and large. And I know you put out a pretty good grocery list for those things for people who are interested.
I want to talk, like, how much time do you have left, by the way? It's 9:30 right now.
I've probably got about like 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, like let's talk quickly about like what do you think of like protein powders? Because I get this question like every day, like what's the best protein powder? Like, are you pro or
Yeah,
anti?
I also real quick, I realized I didn't finish answering your last question, which is what do I tend to do for a diet? I basically, I use this guy, Ronnie Smith. He was sort of he had a company called Energy Concepts back in the day. Was never online. So bless him for that. But he basically was, his whole thing was like food. You should eat foods that have a high or energetic yield or micronutrient yield relative to like a minimal energetic expenditure, right? His whole thing was digestion, absorption, utilization. So if you can digest it easily, then it'll assimilate easy and you can utilize the nutrients easy, right? So that would mean things like fruit, that would mean things like meat, that might mean things like raw dairy, that might mean like things like that. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have stuff literally not meant for human consumption. Let's say like some of the gums, stabilizers, artificial sweeteners, like, stuff like that, seed oils, right? And then there's a spectrum in between there, right? And that's where I think a lot of people get lost. You look at things like nuts, like, which I love macadamia nuts. I might have them on occasion, but when it comes to nuts or like, let's say legumes and lentils or beans, like those are things like you could have on occasion, but probably shouldn't constitute the bulk of your diet because are there nutrients in there? Yeah, but they're more likely to be like blocked or you're going to have a hard time extracting them from that because of either anti-nutrients and or whatever nutrients or energy you get is offset by the relatively high digestive expenditure just to get them, right? And or in some cases with these foods, potentially some level of inflammation. So I think that that might sound complex. It's actually really simple. You just want to eat foods that have a high level of energy density relative to a minimal energetic expenditure from having to deal with inflammation or energy stealing aspects of them and or digestive responsibilities, right? And it doesn't mean that you like, hey, I would never eat nuts or anything like that and create a weird phobia around this stuff. It's more just like, I'm going to probably stick most of my diet to these kinds of things and certain vegetables, right? And I'm probably going to avoid these things as much as I can for the most part. And then things here I might have on occasion. I might have a little teeny bit of corn if I'm going to get Mexican food once in a blue moon, right? I definitely have Mexican food more than that, but you know what I'm saying.
We don't like
And
the
then
food fear, right?
yeah,
Around some of these things, like
it's just context. It's like what you're going to use. There's tools you use at your house and you're working on your house, right? There's some that you're going to use all the fucking time, like a hammer. There's some that you're going to bust out every now and then, right? Same thing.
okay, so
and then your next question was, protein powders. So I like collagen and gelatin because it's literally just like a broken down nutrient itself. I have some kids that are really pressed for like getting nutrition in. So I might have them do like a really high quality, like, goat whey or a really high quality raw whey based type thing. But I'm really on the whole, like not a fan of protein powders outside of that. So let's say 99% of what's on the market. And before I got into doing what I do now, I started in nutritional supplements and I've been in that industry in some capacity since 2008, right? So yeah, you need to eat things that are bioavailable. So whether it's certain extracted things, you can't really like certain, not all of them, but certain vitamins, I would avoid that. And then I would also avoid like foods like, certain protein extracts that are like, yeah, there's protein content in there, but nutrient presence doesn't mean nutrient absorbability, right? Nutrient availability doesn't mean I'm gonna absorb it.
yeah.
So I would avoid protein powder for the most part, except for collagen and gelatin. Certain really high quality whey proteins for kids, and or people dealing with gut stuff and they don't really have the appetites. I could see a situation where some of that could like come into play, but you're talking like crazy hypoallergenic proteins, and even then, I'm not sure you're guaranteed to absorb all the nutrients from that.
Yeah, I get so many DMs like, "What's your favorite protein?" And I was like, I don't
Real
feel good about just recommending one and like getting like a $10 commission off of it. It's just like not even worth it to me. Where it's like, because I do think most of them are a waste of money, and I don't think they're actually like healthy. I don't like they're in that same ballpark as like what I was talking about, like the processed products that we see, where it's like, okay, it's not like gonna destroy your body, but those can be hard to digest for people too.
Yeah.
Collagen's one that I'm really like on the fence about because like I just hear so many conflicting things about it. Like I don't know how much research has actually been done to prove it one way or another. Like I actually took some today. I haven't been taking it, but like I guess why do you believe in that one? Not that I disagree with you. I'm just curious if you've seen any like broad research that's like, yeah, this stuff's actually helping people, or it's not even. Because I've seen other people be like, your body can't even process it, and it just becomes like
Yeah.
waste in
Yeah.
the body.
For sure. I mean, and you or anybody else are always welcome to disagree with me. I'm certainly not the end all be all, and I hope I don't come across that way. But that's how things progress is open discourse, right? That's why you never want to shut or censor scientific discourse down, right? So, as far as collagen and gelatin goes, in terms of a nutrient bioavailability standpoint, I like it because it's just the literal, like, the connective tissue of the animal that's been broken down, their own joints and ligaments, right? It's not some like extract, sans, maybe some of these other nutrients that could, or components that might sort of limit its bioavailability. It's just the thing itself. So that's one. For two, my belief, and if you look at the research, I think it also sort of is in line with this, is that we used to consume collagen just like how we used to consume liver or thyroid in our food. Our meat used to actually still have that in there. And if you look at indigenous tribes that ate nose to tail, like they obviously ate that way too, right? Not that that's always the best example for grading these things, but I think that you know so for one, I think that people like your guy Mark Sisson, which I think in this case, I'm not saying in all cases, but in this case, I think he's right. We operate on something of a collagen deficiency where we're running on usually at least, I believe it's like 20 to 25, if not 30 gram deficiencies on that per day compared to what people used to get in. And I think if you look at our various structures of the body, like tendons, if you look at hair, skin, nails, stuff like that, it is made up of collagen. So I think even before getting into the scientific weeds, there is some like logic there. And then I think if you're looking at certain collagen research-based scientists like Dr. Keith Barr, they've talked extensively about how basically collagen can help with things like injury prevention potentially by creating like some of the physiology that helps us adapt to placing a higher amount of demand on some of our tendons. I think there's like when you see conflicting research, I think it's because we're still learning how some of these things work when it comes to like tendon physiology and stuff like that. I think B, there's probably like anything, there's a quality control, right? Okay, if I'm looking at a nutrient like a vitamin B1, like thiamine, something that I really, that I use versus like a big box version like Costco. If the research looked at that version, it's probably going to say it didn't work. If it looked at the kind I use, maybe it would say something different, right? Maybe it'd say it worked. So I think you have to just kind of take that context in there. And then it's like, what are they measuring, right? How are they valid? What's the validational metrics they're looking at to see whether collagen worked or not? And sometimes I think they're just like majoring in the minors or measuring the wrong things. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like,
totally. So like
what's
there's
the
always nuance to everything nutrition. It's like, oh yeah, let's eat a bunch of soy, and it's like, but or whatever it is, grains, beans, any of these things, like, okay, like if you're going to eat those things, there is a wisdom that comes along with it and like a tradition that we've lost. Like you're supposed to soak, ferment, sprout them to make them more digestible, things like that. And it's like all these nuances apply to pretty much across the board, whatever
yeah,
collagen brand you might be buying. But like I have heard Sisson, who like of all the gurus in health, like, because I don't, people like have like try to convince me I'm not a health guru. I don't have like some secret like thing that I've invented, like the glucose goddess, where I'm like, oh yeah, we need to go eat our food in a certain order, where you're trying to like change the game by some discovery that you made, but you're really just pulling stuff out of your ass. Like I'm not a guru, you know what I mean? But like
you're my guru
Sisson,
though, but I just want to point that out.
Sisson, I have who I went to school. He's like the professor of like the Primal Health Institute where I got my health coaching certification. And like, it's all like, he kind of combines like the ancestral wisdom with like new age science and whatnot. So it's very science science-based, like whatever they taught us, but I have heard him say that collagen should be like the fourth macronutrient, where it's like you got protein, carbs, fat, and then collagen. I mean, he's selling collagen also, but it's like there's all these dynamics at play. But it made sense to me because, like you said, we're not eating these. People have like really shifted more towards like the lean cuts of meat where they're not getting collagen naturally in their diet. They're not like eating a lot of bone broth. They're not like, let's cook up some oxtail. It's like they're not getting it from natural sources. So it's like, okay, maybe we can supplement with that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
it is an
actually.
interesting combo.
Yeah, I'm actually about to have some Caribbean food, including some oxtail, I think tomorrow actually. But
Oh yeah,
yeah,
where are you
that's
going?
also just I forgot the name of the place, but anyways, I'll shoot it to you later. But yeah, one thing I wanted to mention, you talk about people eating these lean cuts of meat with no fat. That's another, like that's actually a big mistake I see a lot of NBA guys make. Is like even before some of these extreme diets, I'll see these guys shift away from like, oh, I'm not going to eat eggs, I'm not going to eat any red meat, I'm not, or hardly any red meat, I'm not going to eat any raw dairy, stuff like that. And then they shift and they're like, they shift to these like chicken, rice, not quite pescatarian type diets where they're eating those things, vegetables, like some carbs, maybe not a ton. And then they start, even guys who move well, right? Like let's say like a Jimmy Butler or a Kawhi, somebody like that. Somebody's got good, pretty solid, sound, natural biomechanics. And then they start having these ticky-tack injuries add up where they're playing like 60, 65 games a year. And they seem to kind of like pick and choose when they like use these, like use their energy more for the playoffs or certain games or certain times in the fourth quarter as much when they have this high ceiling that they can tap into when they want to. And maybe they had a little bit more of an unlimited gas tank earlier in their career. And I think some of that comes from like, if you're not eating good, healthy, kind of more saturated based fats, you're going to lose your body literally synthesizes things like cholesterol and saturated fat into the protective anti-stress steroid hormones, things like pregnenolone, progesterone, DHEA, stuff like that, right? Things that help us recover and adapt to an 82 game season, right? Or adapt to the physicality of the NFL. So I think like diminished steroid synthesis and hormonal capabilities, right, is also hormonal currency is also something that like is seeding this. Just to give people like one example of going into the weeds on some of these things instead of giving them like only kind of very general information here.
So we don't want to go too extreme anyway. I have it be taking out fats, taking out carbs, taking
Yeah,
out animal proteins. It's like always, we want to kind of try to keep the answers in the middle. We're going to like, I don't even have a problem anymore. I think like when I first started on this, I was like, don't eat egg whites. But like, if you are trying to like improve your protein consumption and like maybe gain muscle, like that's a lever that you can obviously pull. And like, I don't want to eat, 4 pounds of meat a day. And it's like easy for me if I'm cooking with all full eggs with the yolks to add some egg whites at times just to get like cheap, easy protein. Like if I'm making a scramble, like I don't have a problem with that, but like going fully over there where you're drinking skim milk and eating egg whites and only eating chicken breasts, like you basically like there's like a intuition with it where it's like where was the farmer, like when did that happen in history where they're like, oh, let's separate the yolks from the eggs? Like nobody
right.
did that back in the day. It's like all these things were made really in like perfect to give you like all the nutrients that you need. And like when we start separating it from its nature, we see some of these imbalances start to occur.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's if we had to do one takeaway from this, because I got to dip here in a sec to get to this uh, this next session, next appointment. I mean, I just leave people with that, right? Like a lot of this stuff at the end of the day is for optimizing your own health or for athletic performance is really just about kind of living in alignment with creating an environment that humans are meant to thrive in, right? It's like when you feed your dog, you treat your dog, you take care of your dog and you treat your dog how dogs were meant to be treated, right? It's probably going to bed at the same time. It's probably getting fed well, hopefully not some grain food, but, you know, ideally you're feeding it like real food, right? You're walking it. It's getting time out in the sun. It's getting time to roam free. It's not living a stressful life. Like, apply those same principles to humans and you could probably have a pretty healthy, high functioning human. Is like, get away from this evolutionary mismatch that we've occurred over evolutionary mismatch, environmental mismatch that's built up over time, and try to look at, you know, think of alchemy, right? Think of each individual domain: sleep, light, diet, all that shit. And then you basically just try to create a minimum effective dose and then, you know, apply that to yourself. And you kind of watch your energy, your health, your performance, your resilience to stress, aka adaptability. You see all those things improve. You know what I mean?
Right. It's very simple, like when you kind of look at it like that, where it's like, eat as much real food as possible. And when I say that, I'm talking about like the food itself should be the ingredient, you know, like blueberries,
Yeah.
wild caught salmon, you know, carrots, whatever it is that you're eating, fruits, vegetables, animal protein, quality fats, like not the highly refined, industrialized vegetable and seed oils that have just, who knows what they're really going through with like the stainless steel vats and the degummers and the deodorizer and all this high heat and hexane. It's just like way too much processing going on that it's kind of nothing that the human body's ever dealt with before, and just giving it what it's always dealt with, which is sunlight, real food, community, natural movement, you know, walking, just the very basics. It's like everyone's looking for some secret with health, but it's actually like pretty boring when you think about it. Like
Right.
there are some things that you can do if like you are at that level where you're like, okay, I want to get optimized now, you know, and like we're doing all these little tinkering, but like most people, we're not nearing 50% obesity because you're not taking the right supplements or you're not taking green juice powders. It's like you just need to do the basics and slowly shift from whatever lifestyle habits that you're really embodying to like more of these that are in line with our ancestry and our lineage.
Yeah. And I think if there is any kind, sometimes there's stop gaps, things that we need to do to address reality, right? And so I think that is sort of inherently the problem of maybe the 82 game schedule and changing time zones and not having good sleep with like the NBA, for example, is sometimes like sunlight, consistent sleep, some of those things can like they're just not possible. So it's like, all right, then how do we work around that? What are extra things that we can do to mitigate that? And that's where some of like the details do come in and matter. Maybe then it's like, all right, and that's where I need to kind of quote unquote supplement my life, not just literal supplements, but look at things like some grounding technologies or red light therapy, stuff like that. That is where some of that stuff does have a place and it can live in there. It's just anyways.
100%. So like, yeah, I wanted
saying.
to
It's
ask
like
you that because
fundamentals first.
you do see some of these as you give us a tour of your apartment, you do see like
I'm
these
giving
athletes,
you extra time, buddy.
these athletes and
That's my way of giving
coaches.
you extra time. Is
We
just sort
love
of like bringing you on my getting ready fucking excursion.
We're here for it. So these athletes and coaches, especially in the NBA, because other leagues have different schedules, they're almost working a graveyard shift in a lot of ways, where it's like your game is starting at 7:30, you're not done till 10:30, then you're watching film, you're having a glass of wine, you're not getting home, like, and you're exposed to all this light in the stadium, stimulation, adrenaline is pumping. They've shown studies that like people that work the graveyard shift like have serious way higher risks to cancer and different like very serious diseases. So I guess like you talk about some of these ways to supplement. We're not talking about like a pill necessarily. Like, what is the best way in your opinion to kind of offset like that graveyard shift lifestyle for some of these guys? I'm like so curious of this.
Yeah, it's crazy. So there's actually a study you can look up called, not that you need a study to like prove some of the stuff's bad. I mean, you referenced a lot of really good research just on generally how throwing your sleep cycle off is really harmful for humans, maybe the most harmful thing. But there's a study they actually did on NBA players. I believe it's called The Negative Influence of Air Travel on Professional Basketball Players or the National Basketball Association. I'll post the study after so people can check it out. But I actually like a lot of what they said in that article because it falls in line with some of these physiological principles that I subscribe to, right? Including increasing like your carbohydrate load during times of stress is another reason not to go low carb. They talk about that, including getting in plenty of good natural sugars, raw honey, fruit juice, stuff like that. There's things like grounding, right? I know that sounds like woo woo, but there is a science to it, as far as like trying to, wherever you land, if you're on the road, you're an athlete, whatever, have some kind of graveyard shift. I think spending more time in nature when you can is important. I think from a nutritional standpoint too, when you do need to go to bed, if it's like, let's say, off compared to when you normally go to bed, it's one of those things where trying to time it with some like high, like I would say raw honey is probably a simple one. Raw honey or some kind of sugar, and then also like some sort of like calcium, something like milk tends to be my go-to for helping people sleep, even if it's in general, let alone if it's at a weird time.
But you're taking the cherry juice.
Cherry juice, yeah, you could do that too. Sunlight as much as you can, and then whatever regular days you can have. Let's say if you're one day is off, but the next day you can kind of have a normal sleep-wake cycle. Like I think just trying to create some consistency there.
So taking advantage of the times when you are able to get to bed at a reasonable hour, getting outside, and you're talking about upping your carbohydrates from like natural sources within the food matrix, being fruits, raw honey. Like those are some things that people on a graveyard shift could potentially do. I always think that like the antidote for all these things is like getting outside more. The antidote for being on your phone so much, getting outside.
Yeah.
And when you talk about grounding, you're talking about literally
being
going barefoot into the grass or the sand, wherever you are. It's like touching the earth physically, creating that connection. There's like a lot of emerging research in that field.
Yeah. Actually, there is. It's something that sounds very, very woo woo, but there is a lot of exciting research there.
It was woo woo when I started doing it like 6 years ago, and like literally I was working for a different NBA team at the time, and every time I jumped on a conference call, like they'd have the whole staff on there, and they'd be like, "Hey, Jared, what are you grounding, freaking nutcase?" And like now it's like, oh, this was the way all along.
Right.
And I'm like, okay,
yeah, exactly.
you guys laugh.
I used to do that in the morning. Actually, with some old roommates I had, and I'm pretty sure they thought I was fucking nuts. But now it's,
you got a blue tongue on. You got the blue tongue right now. So yeah, we definitely know
I do.
you crossed the line with some of these things, but that's what we that's what we love about it. So.
Getting a nice view of my habits in private life, thanks to Jared.
You got the high ceilings, so
And I wake up with natural light. There you go. Boom.
You don't even cover those at all,
Skylights.
like with blackout curtains.
No, I don't need to. It's a night sky up there, buddy, at night.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's different for everybody. I've got like
I don't live in the heart of
stuff. Like, I need them with alley lights and all that. But all right, bro, we'll let you go, man. It was
I gotta
from you dropping knowledge. This will be posted on both of our feeds if any of you guys want to revert back to it, listen to it in a more calm environment or something when you're cooking or in your car, and you can kind of consume it as opposed to just dropping in on Instagram really quick. So
yes, sir.
All right,
I appreciate
bro.
you having me on. I'm sure we'll do it again sometime. All right, late.
All right, thanks everybody.